Mafia boss caught his maid stealing food and followed her to a broken single mom. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the main characters. Emily Thompson had always prided herself on being independent. A maid working for the powerful mafia boss, Vincent Moretti, in his lavish mansion in Manhattan, she never expected to become entangled in something far beyond her control. She'd never asked for the job, but after losing her previous one and unable to find a better opportunity, it was the only one that paid enough to keep a roof over her head. Emily had learned to navigate the world of power, luxury, and secrecy. She had learned how to serve her boss and keep her distance from the world he inhabited. That was until one evening, as she sneaked a quick bite from the kitchen, a little something to quell the hunger she'd been ignoring for hours. Vincent appeared out of nowhere, his towering figure casting a shadow over her. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been caught. But what happened next wasn't what she expected. Instead of a harsh reprimand or punishment, Vincent's gaze softened for just a moment, as if studying her. Emily, aware of the rules she'd been taught to never break, quickly apologized and prepared to retreat, but his voice stopped her. "Where are you going, Emily?" he asked, his tone unexpectedly calm, almost curious. She could only stare back at him, unsure of what was coming next. Vincent, a man known for his sharp decisions and quick temper, didn't seem angry. He wasn't reprimanding her either. Emily's confusion deepened as he simply watched her, waiting for her to speak. And then, without warning, he turned and started walking out of the kitchen, signaling her to follow. She did so hesitantly, her mind racing, until they reached the back door. There, Vincent spoke again, his words more deliberate this time. "I'm following you." Emily, still bewildered, couldn't stop herself from asking, why? His eyes met hers, full of a strange, unreadable emotion. "Because," he replied simply, "you're not just a maid to me. I need to know who you are." Emily didn't understand. She had never been anything more than an employee to him, and the thought that Vincent Moretti, the feared mafia boss, was following her was almost too absurd to process. She had no choice but to continue leading him, trying her best to ignore the tremor in her hands. They walked through the streets of the city, Vincent's presence a constant weight behind her. Eventually, they arrived at her small, run-down apartment. Emily unlocked the door and stepped inside, but Vincent didn't wait to be invited. He walked in right behind her, his demeanor far too confident for someone who didn't belong. Inside the cramped, dimly lit room, Emily's reality began to sink in. The apartment was a far cry from the mansion she had come from, and it hit her hard just how different her world was from Vincent's. Still, he stood there, silent, as he observed her surroundings. It felt as though every corner of her life had been exposed. As he looked around, Emily couldn't help but feel exposed as well. She knew what he was thinking, the thought that he might judge her. But instead, he said nothing. It was in that moment, standing there in her modest home, that she realized just how little she knew about Vincent Moretti. He had followed her here without a word, without any indication of his thoughts. And yet, for the first time, Emily could feel a strange shift in the air. Something was changing between them, something that would alter the course of both their lives forever. Emily stood frozen for a moment as Vincent casually stepped into her tiny apartment. The cold, concrete walls seemed to close in around her, and she couldn't help but feel exposed under the weight of his intense gaze. She had never imagined this. Vincent Moretti, the mafia boss she worked for, the man she feared and admired from a distance, was now standing in her living room, looking around as though it was his right. She quickly recovered, her mind racing for something to say, something to break the uncomfortable silence. "I wasn't expecting company," she said, her voice trembling slightly, betraying her calm exterior. Vincent didn't respond right away. He simply walked further into the room, his eyes scanning every corner of the modest space. It was clear he didn't need to say much. The room, with its chipped paint, worn furniture, and the faint smell of old takeout, told him everything he needed to know about her life. Emily watched him, anxiety building as he moved. This wasn't just a visit, she realized. He had followed her here, and he wasn't leaving until he got answers. Answers she wasn't sure she was ready to give. Finally, Vincent turned to face her. His dark eyes locked with hers, and for the first time, she saw something different in them. Something softer, though still intense. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "Tell you what?" Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "That you're living like this," he replied, gesturing toward the room around them. She felt her cheeks flush, both embarrassed and defensive. "It's none of your business," she said quickly, but Vincent's stare didn't waver. "It is," he said simply. "You're working for me, and I'm responsible for those I employ. If I'm going to trust you in my home, I need to know who you really are." Emily didn't know how to respond. She had spent so much of her life hiding, working hard to keep her head down and her life out of anyone else's hands. But now, here she was, in front of the most powerful man she knew, and she realized just how little control she actually had. She sat down on the worn sofa, her mind spinning as Vincent stood by the window, looking out over the city. The silence stretched between them, heavy and full of unspoken words. "I never asked for your help," she finally said, her voice quieter now. "I didn't ask for anything." Vincent's eyes flickered to her, his expression unreadable. "You don't need to ask," he replied, his tone soft but unyielding. "I'm offering it anyway, because you deserve more than this." Emily's heart skipped a beat at his words, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel something. Hope, maybe, or fear. She wasn't sure which. But she knew one thing. Vincent wasn't going to leave her alone, not now. He would get what he wanted, and that included understanding her, her life, and her past. And no matter how much she tried to deny it, there was something about his presence that made it hard to walk away. She had always been independent, relying on herself to get by. But standing there, with Vincent's eyes still on her, she couldn't help but wonder what life would be like if she let him in, even just a little. Would it be worth it? She couldn't say yet. But one thing was clear, this was only the beginning. The next few days were a blur for Emily. Vincent had left her apartment that night with a few words hanging in the air, his figure disappearing into the night, but his presence lingered. Despite the overwhelming chaos in her life, she found herself wondering about him. The cold, unfeeling Mafia boss who had seen something in her, something that had made him offer her a chance, and out from the life she had been living for years. The next morning, she returned to work, her usual routine of cleaning and serving meals, but it felt different now. The mansion seemed quieter, the walls seemed to close in a little more, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Vincent was watching her, even when he wasn't there. It wasn't just his physical presence that had changed things, it was the way she saw him now. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He wasn't just the man who paid her bills. There was something deeper there, something she hadn't noticed before. It had been 2 days since that night, and when Emily entered the kitchen for her usual shift, she was startled to see Vincent standing by the marble counter, looking at the detailed plans for the mansion's renovations. He had his back to her, and she hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach. Was he here to check up on her? Was it just another job? She couldn't tell. He turned around just as she stepped closer, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was no anger, no reprimand in his gaze, just that familiar intensity. "I hope you've had time to think about what I said," he said, his voice smooth and calm. Emily swallowed, her throat dry. "I don't know what to think," she admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. "It's all a lot to take in." Vincent took a step closer, his presence looming in the otherwise empty kitchen. He was always a step ahead, always in control. "I'm not asking you to make a decision right now, Emily," he said, his voice low, "but I want you to know you don't have to live this way. You have a choice." She looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity, but all she saw was that same unwavering confidence. His words rang in her ears. "You don't have to live this way, Star." It was the first time anyone had ever said something like that to her, and the weight of it pressed on her chest. It was both a relief and a burden. She didn't know if she was ready for the change he was offering, but something inside her was stirring, something that had been dormant for too long. "I don't know if I can accept help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Vincent studied her for a long moment before answering, his gaze softening just slightly. "You don't have to accept anything, Emily. But I'm here if you want to take the chance." Emily felt her heart race as she tried to absorb his words. She had never been the type of person to depend on anyone, but now, standing here in front of Vincent, she couldn't ignore the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could. Maybe there was a way out of the life she had been trapped in. Vincent didn't press her further. He simply nodded, as if understanding that the decision couldn't be rushed. "Take your time," he said softly, then turned to leave the kitchen. But before he walked out the door, he looked back over his shoulder at her, his eyes meeting hers once again. "I'm not going anywhere, Emily. When you're ready, I'll be here." As the door clicked shut behind him, Emily stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt like she had a choice. A choice she had never imagined having. And that small spark of hope, no matter how faint, was all she needed to keep going. The days that followed were a strange mix of uncertainty and curiosity for Emily. She couldn't shake the feeling of Vincent's presence in her life. His words kept echoing in her mind. "When you're ready, I'll be here." She had never considered herself someone who needed help, but now, in the silence of her apartment, she found herself questioning everything. It wasn't just about the money, or the job, or even the mansion she worked in. It was about the choices she hadn't made. It was about the life she had settled for. Vincent had opened a door she wasn't sure she was ready to walk through. She had been surviving, but he had shown her what it could be like to live. Every time she went to work at the mansion, she felt that nagging pull to look for something more, something beyond the walls of the lavish estate. Vincent had a way of making her question her own boundaries, her own choices. But it wasn't just his power that made her hesitate. It was the fear of what it meant to trust someone like him. She had worked hard to keep her distance, to keep her life separate from the world he represented. But with every passing day, she found herself more drawn to him, not because of his wealth or status, but because of the softness she occasionally glimpsed beneath the surface. It wasn't long before Vincent reached out again. One evening, after a long shift, Emily was heading to her apartment when she saw a sleek black car pull up outside. She froze as Vincent stepped out, looking every bit the powerful man he was. Yet there was something different in his stride. Instead of the usual distant aura of authority, there was a quiet calmness that made Emily's heart skip a beat. "I thought I'd walk you home," he said simply, his gaze steady but not imposing. Emily, though surprised, didn't protest. There was something comforting about the idea of not being alone. The walk was slow, almost peaceful, and they didn't speak much. But in the silence, Emily felt an unspoken understanding grow between them. She realized how different things were with Vincent. He wasn't the frightening Mafia boss she had imagined when she first started working for him. He was just a man, like any other, with his own past, his own struggles, and his own reasons for being the way he was. As they reached the door to her apartment, Vincent hesitated, his hand hovering near the doorknob. "Do you ever think about what you want?" he asked, his voice quiet but serious. Emily felt the question hit her harder than she expected. What did she want? She had been so focused on surviving, on getting by, that she had never allowed herself the space to think about what she truly desired. She looked up at Vincent, his face unreadable, but there was a softness in his eyes she hadn't noticed before. For a moment, she considered telling him everything, her fears, her dreams, her doubts. But she didn't. Instead, she simply nodded. "Sometimes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's hard to know what that is when you've never had the chance to choose." Vincent's expression softened further. He didn't speak for a long moment, as if contemplating her words. Then, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You don't have to decide everything right now," he said gently. "But when you do, you won't be alone." Emily didn't know how to respond. His words stirred something deep inside her, something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. She had been so used to depending on no one, but now, standing there with Vincent, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could. With a quiet sigh, she stepped inside her apartment, the door clicking shut behind her. As she sat down on her couch, she realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving. She was starting to live. And Vincent Moretti, the man who had once seemed so distant, was the one who had shown her the way. Emily had spent the past week caught between the weight of her own independence and the strange pull Vincent seemed to have on her life. He had given her the space she needed to think, but every day felt like a battle with herself. On the one hand, she was grateful for the opportunity to escape her old life, for the chance to do something different, to choose something other than just surviving. But on the other hand, the life she had lived for so long, the life of struggle, of never asking for help, of doing everything on her own, felt hard to let go of. She didn't know how to accept kindness, or if she even deserved it. She had lived in the shadows for so long that stepping into the light felt like a foreign concept. But every time she thought of Vincent, she couldn't shake the feeling that maybe he was offering her something she didn't even know she needed. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He just wanted her to be happy, to find a way out of the life that had held her back for so long. That thought haunted her as she went about her daily routine at the mansion. Vincent had made it clear that he wasn't just offering a job or a handout. He was offering a chance at something more, a chance for her to have a real future. But what did that future look like? Emily didn't know. She had been working for Vincent for months, but now it felt like everything was changing. Every glance from him felt charged with meaning. Every conversation laced with something unspoken. One evening, as Emily was finishing up her shift, Vincent approached her with a question she didn't expect. "Emily," he said, his voice softer than usual, "have you thought about what I said?" She stopped in her tracks, unsure of how to respond. Of course, she had thought about it. Every day? But how could she tell him that? How could she admit that she didn't know what she was supposed to do with the life he was offering her? "I have," she replied, her voice barely audible. Vincent looked at her with an unreadable expression, his eyes softening just a little. "I know it's not easy," he said, "but you don't have to decide everything all at once. Take your time." Emily felt a weight lift off her shoulders at his words. He wasn't pressuring her. He wasn't trying to force her into something she wasn't ready for. He was giving her the space to figure it out on her own, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could. The following days were quieter, but the tension between them remained. Every time they spoke, every time they shared a moment, Emily felt the uncertainty tug at her. But she also felt something else, a spark of hope. She had spent so many years convincing herself that she didn't need anyone, that she could handle everything on her own. But now, she wasn't so sure. The life Vincent was offering her wasn't just about escaping her past. It was about having a future, about having the chance to live, not just survive. One evening, Vincent asked her to meet him outside after work. As she stepped into the cool night air, she saw him waiting by his car, his hands resting casually in his pockets. He looked at her with that familiar intensity, but there was something different in his eyes this time. "Emily," he began, his voice steady but kind, "I know you've been struggling with this decision, and I don't want you to feel like you're alone in it." Emily felt a surge of emotions, a mix of relief and fear. "I'm not sure I can do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Vincent took a step closer, his gaze softening. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," he said. "But when you are, I'll be here. You're not alone in this anymore." And for the first time, Emily believed him. She had spent so long living in the shadows, too afraid to step out into the light. But now, she felt like she was standing at the edge of something new, something real. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a choice. A choice to be something more than what she had always been. The following week was filled with a quiet, tension-filled anticipation. Emily had spent every day trying to process Vincent's offer and his words. He had been patient, giving her the space she needed to think, but the weight of the decision still hung heavily on her. She didn't know if she was ready to fully step into the life he was offering, but she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. Vincent wasn't like anyone she had ever known. He wasn't just the powerful Mafia boss she had always feared. He was also a man who seemed to care, in his own way. His actions weren't always kind or conventional, but they were consistent, and that meant something. As the days went by, Emily found herself questioning the life she had been living. Was she really happy? Had she ever been? The small apartment, the low-paying job, the constant struggle just to get by, it was all she had known. But could she be more than that? Could she really let Vincent in, let him change her life, when she had spent so long pushing others away? One evening, Vincent invited her to dinner. It wasn't a grand, extravagant affair like most of the events she had seen him host. It was just the two of them in a quiet, intimate setting in his office, with a simple meal prepared by his private chef. When Emily arrived, She was greeted by Vincent with the same calm, steady presence that had both comforted and unnerved her over the past few months. He didn't rush her, didn't pressure her to make any decisions. Instead, he simply asked about her day, listened as she spoke about her work, her struggles, and the dreams she had once harbored but had pushed aside. For the first time, Emily allowed herself to be vulnerable, to let him see the side of her that had been buried for so long. She hadn't realized how much she had needed this conversation until it was happening. As they sat together, Vincent's gaze was warm but firm, and his attention never wavered. It was clear he wasn't just hearing her. He was truly listening. And that made all the difference. "You don't have to decide everything tonight, Emily," he said, his voice gentle but serious. "But I want you to know that whatever you choose, I'm here. You don't have to go back to that life if you don't want to. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for." Emily looked at him, the words settling deep inside her. She had always been used to doing everything on her own, to standing strong no matter the cost. But Vincent's offer, his patience, was something she hadn't expected. She wasn't sure she was ready to let go of the life she knew, but there was something about him that made her believe she could try. As the evening wore on, they talked more, laughed a little, and even shared moments of silence that felt comforting instead of awkward. It wasn't the grand gestures or the promises of wealth that made her think about her future with Vincent. It was his steadiness, his willingness to let her take the lead, to make her own choices. As the night came to a close, Vincent walked her to the door, his hand lightly brushing against hers as he said, "Whenever you're ready, Emily, I'll be here. You don't have to make any decisions tonight." Emily stepped outside, her heart racing in her chest. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had options. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but she knew one thing. She wasn't alone anymore. Vincent had given her the freedom to choose, and that was all she had ever needed. Emily's life had slowly started to take shape in ways she hadn't anticipated. For the first time in years, she wasn't simply existing. She was living, with the possibility of something better, something more. Vincent's constant presence in her life had become a quiet reassurance, and each time she saw him, she found herself more and more willing to consider the future he offered. The moments they shared had become something she looked forward to. It wasn't just about the wealth, the power, or the lavish lifestyle. It was about him, Vincent, who had shown her that life could be more than just about surviving. It was about feeling, about choosing to trust someone. Still, she wasn't ready to let go of the life she knew. The transition from her old existence to this new one wasn't going to be easy, and she had her doubts. The freedom that Vincent offered felt like both a blessing and a burden. Emily knew she couldn't change everything overnight, but she also knew she didn't have to do it alone. Vincent had made that clear. One afternoon, Vincent invited Emily to meet him at one of his properties in the city. It was a place she hadn't been before, one of the many buildings he owned, and this one had a different kind of atmosphere, more personal, less businesslike. As she arrived, she found him standing outside, waiting for her with that familiar quiet intensity. He greeted her with a small smile, but his eyes were searching, almost as though he was waiting for her to say something. "How have you been, Emily?" he asked, his voice warm, his gaze steady. She shrugged slightly, unsure of how to express everything she had been feeling. "It's been overwhelming, but good," she said after a moment. "I've been thinking about everything you've said." Vincent nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he had been expecting this. "And what have you decided?" Emily hesitated. She didn't know if she had decided anything, but she couldn't deny the way her heart fluttered when she thought about what Vincent had been offering her. For the first time in a long time, she had the chance to think about her own desires, about what she wanted out of life. And that was something she had never allowed herself before. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice quiet. "I don't know if I'm ready, but I want to be." Vincent didn't say anything at first. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he stepped forward, his presence both comforting and overwhelming. "You don't have to be ready right now," he said, his tone gentle. "But when you are, I'll be here. There's no rush. You don't have to figure it all out today." Emily looked at him, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. The idea of taking the leap, of trusting someone enough to let them in, was still daunting. But with Vincent, for the first time in her life, she felt like it might be possible. She had spent so long holding on to her independence, to the belief that she could only rely on herself. But now, standing here with Vincent, she felt like she was finally letting go of the chains she had built around herself. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes meeting his, "for giving me the time." Vincent gave her a small smile, one that reached his eyes and softened his usually hard expression. "Take all the time you need," he replied. "You deserve it." And for the first time, Emily felt like she truly did. She had spent so many years feeling like she wasn't worthy of something better, but Vincent's simple words, his quiet support, made her believe that maybe she could have more. Maybe she could have a future that wasn't defined by her past. As the day turned to evening, Emily and Vincent stood together on the balcony of his property, overlooking the city that stretched out before them. It was quiet, peaceful, and for a moment, Emily let herself imagine a life she had never dared to dream of. A life where she could be more than just a survivor. A life where she could choose, for the first time, to live. The weeks that followed felt like a slow, deliberate unraveling for Emily. She found herself at a crossroads, standing between the life she had always known and the one that Vincent had shown her. Each day, she felt herself inch closer to something new, something unfamiliar, yet somehow comforting. Vincent had kept his word. He had never pushed her to make any decisions, never rushed her into anything she wasn't ready for. But he also hadn't disappeared, as she had secretly feared. He had stayed, patiently waiting, his presence constant, like the steady ticking of a clock that refused to let her forget the promise of a life beyond what she had known. Emily continued to work at the mansion, but there was a shift in her interactions with Vincent. She no longer felt like an outsider in his world, like a mere employee. She had begun to understand the complexities of his life, the struggles that came with the power he wielded. Vincent had allowed her to see glimpses of the man behind the Mafia boss facade, his vulnerability, his quiet strength, his ability to care deeply for those he allowed into his life. One evening, as she was cleaning one of the many rooms in the mansion, Emily overheard a conversation between Vincent and his trusted associate, Marco. It wasn't meant for her ears, but she couldn't help but overhear snippets of their discussion as she moved around the room, pretending to be occupied with her work. "She's different, Vincent." Marco's voice was low but firm. "I can see it in her. She's not like the others." There was a brief silence before Vincent responded, his tone more measured than usual. "I know. That's why I'm giving her space. She needs to make her own choice. I'm not forcing anything on her." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected to hear Vincent speak so openly about her, let alone acknowledge the fact that he was giving her the freedom to decide. She had always known that Vincent wasn't like the men she had encountered in her past, but hearing it from him, hearing his resolve to let her take the lead, made her feel something she hadn't felt in years: hope. She paused for a moment, standing still in the room, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. For the first time, she realized that she wasn't just a part of his world by chance. Vincent had intentionally brought her into his life, not because he needed her, but because he wanted to. When the conversation ended, Emily continued with her work, but her mind was spinning. She had always thought of herself as a survivor, someone who could handle anything life threw at her. But now, with Vincent's words echoing in her head, she couldn't ignore the feeling that maybe she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was starting to live. That night, as she sat in her small apartment, Emily found herself thinking about the life Vincent had offered her once more. She had spent so long living in the shadows, afraid of what might happen if she let someone in. But Vincent had shown her a different way. He had given her the space to choose, the time to decide, and most importantly, he had never treated her like she was anything less than capable of making her own decisions. The weight of the choice ahead of her still felt heavy, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to face it. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't alone. She had Vincent, and for the first time, she was allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have more than just a life of survival. She could have a future that was hers to decide. Emily had spent the last few days turning over Vincent's words in her mind. She couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him, but her hesitation lingered. The life he offered was a far cry from the one she had built for herself. It was more than just the grand mansion, the wealth, or the lavish lifestyle. It was the quiet security, the sense of belonging, the idea of not having to face everything alone anymore. But it was also terrifying. For years, she had been taught to rely only on herself. But with every conversation, every shared glance, Vincent was challenging that belief, showing her what it could be like to trust someone again. And as much as she wanted to push him away, she couldn't. One evening, after a long shift, Emily found herself standing outside the mansion, staring up at the dark sky. She had been avoiding Vincent for a few days, giving herself space to think. But now, something inside her told her that it was time to stop running. It was time to make a decision, even if she didn't know exactly what that decision was. As she walked toward the back entrance, she saw Vincent standing near the door, waiting for her. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes, as always, were sharp, full of questions. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it. "I know you've been thinking, but you don't have to keep running, Emily." His words hit her like a wave. She had been running, hadn't she? Running from the fear of letting someone else in, running from the fear of trusting him and what that might mean for her future. But now, standing there in front of him, she felt a shift. Maybe it was time to stop running. "I'm not running," she said softly, taking a step closer to him. "I've just been afraid. I don't know how to do this. How to trust again." Vincent's expression softened, and he stepped forward, his presence reassuring yet unwavering. "You don't have to have all the answers, Emily," he said gently. "You just have to trust me enough to try." His words, so simple yet profound, struck a chord within her. She had spent so long trying to handle everything on her own, but here, with Vincent, there was a promise of something different, something better. "I want to try," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Vincent's eyes softened, and for a moment, he said nothing. He simply stepped closer and reached out, his hand gently brushing against hers. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it meant everything. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said quietly. "You don't have to figure everything out right away, but I'll be here whenever you're ready." Emily felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She wasn't alone in this anymore. She didn't have to do it all by herself. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe, like she could take the next step forward without fear holding her back. The future was still uncertain, but now, with Vincent by her side, it didn't seem quite so daunting. As they stood there in the quiet of the night, Emily realized something she hadn't allowed herself to understand before. The choice was hers, and it was a choice she was ready to make. With Vincent's steady presence beside her, she knew she could face whatever came next. And maybe, just maybe, she could finally start living, instead of merely surviving.